He thought kicking her out would protect his showroom, but he had no idea he had just walked straight into his own downfall. The morning sun spilled across the glass walls of Harrison Luxury Motors, turning every polished surface into a mirror of wealth and status. $300,000 coupes gleaming under perfect lighting, marble floors echoing with the quiet authority of expensive shoes. And in the middle of it all stood Emily Carter, almost invisible, her simple white blouse and faded jeans absorbing none of the light that surrounded her, her presence quiet, unassuming, as if she had wandered into the wrong world, or perhaps into a world that had already decided she didn't belong. Blake Harrison noticed her the moment she stepped inside, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. And to a man like him, invisibility was a flaw, something to be corrected, something to be exposed. He adjusted his tailored suit and walked toward her with the slow confidence of someone who believed he owned not just the showroom, but every interaction inside it, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, measuring, judging, dismissing before a single word was spoken. Emily's gaze moved calmly across the vehicles, her fingers lightly brushing the air near a midnight black coupe priced at just under $280,000, as if she was already imagining it in someone else's driveway, her expression thoughtful, almost warm, completely disconnected from the tension beginning to build around her. "Ma'am." Blake's voice cut through the space, smooth but sharp, loud enough to carry, loud enough to invite attention. "Our premium models are typically reserved for serious clients." A subtle emphasis that didn't go unnoticed. A few nearby sales associates exchanged glances, their smirks forming before she even responded, the first ripple of quiet amusement spreading through the room. Emily turned to him, her eyes steady, her voice soft but clear. "I'm interested in that one," she said, nodding toward the coupe. And for a brief moment, there was a pause, a flicker of something almost human in Blake's expression, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by something colder, something performative. "That model starts at $280,000, he replied, this time louder, making sure the couple browsing nearby could hear, making sure everyone could hear. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at something in our used inventory." A light chuckle followed from one of the salesmen behind him, then another, small at first, but enough to turn a private dismissal into a public spectacle. Emily didn't react, not the way they expected, no embarrassment, no apology, just a quiet stillness that seemed to absorb the moment instead of resisting it. Her hands folded lightly in front of her, her posture unchanged, as if she had seen this scene before, as if she already knew how it ended. Blake stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound personal, but not enough to stop others from listening. "We have a certain standard here," he continued, "and I'd hate for you to feel out of place." The words hung in the air, polished, professional, and unmistakably dismissive, the kind of sentence that allowed him to maintain dignity while stripping it from someone else. The room shifted, conversation slowed, eyes turned, drawn to the quiet tension that now filled the space. The contrast between her simplicity and the environment around her becoming sharper, almost uncomfortable, like a painting that didn't belong on the wall it was hung on. Emily nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "I understand," she said, her voice calm, untouched, and for a moment, that calmness unsettled him more than any argument could have, because it didn't give him anything to push against. It didn't validate the performance he had just created. It simply existed, steady, unshaken. She turned and began walking toward the exit, her steps measured, unhurried, the sound of her shoes soft against the marble floor, each step echoing just enough to be noticed, just enough to leave a trace behind. And as the glass doors opened and the sunlight swallowed her silhouette, a strange silence settled over the showroom, brief, almost unspoken, before it was quickly replaced by the return of casual laughter and movement, as if the moment had already been dismissed, already forgotten. But Blake didn't forget, not entirely, because something about the way she left lingered, something unfinished, something that didn't fit the script he was used to. And though he couldn't name it, though he brushed it off with a confident smile and a quick adjustment of his tie, the truth had already begun to take shape beneath the surface, quiet and inevitable, like a storm that hadn't arrived yet, but was already on its way. And by the time he would understand what that silence meant it would be far too late. The laughter returned quickly after she left, filling the showroom with a shallow confidence that echoed louder than before, as if everyone needed to prove the moment had meant nothing. Blake Harrison adjusted his cufflinks and turned back to his clients with a polished smile, resuming his performance as though nothing unusual had happened. But there was a subtle shift in the air, something just beneath the surface that refused to settle completely, a faint discomfort that even he could not quite ignore. Now, as I was saying, Blake continued, gesturing toward the same midnight black coupe Emily had pointed to, his voice smooth and rehearsed. This model represents the pinnacle of engineering and exclusivity. The well-dressed couple nodded, impressed, their attention fully captured, and for a moment, everything felt back under control, exactly the way Blake liked it. Predictable, profitable, and perfectly aligned with his sense of order. Across the showroom, Daniel, the youngest salesman, stood quietly with a tablet in his hands, his eyes drifting toward the glass doors where Emily had exited just minutes ago. He had seen her expression, not humiliation, not anger, but something far more unsettling, composure, and it lingered in his mind like a question he could not answer. He shifted his weight, glancing back at Blake, then down at his screen, unsure why the moment refused to leave him. "Did you see that?" one of the sales associates whispered to another near the espresso bar, their voices low but edged with amusement. "She actually thought she could buy that car." The other smirked, shaking his head. "People really need to know their place." They laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that carried more judgment than humor, reinforcing the invisible lines that defined who belonged and who did not. Blake caught fragments of their conversation and felt a sense of satisfaction settle in. This was how the system worked, how it maintained itself. People like Emily came in, were corrected, and left, order restored, hierarchy preserved. He took a sip of his coffee, already moving on in his mind to more important clients, more valuable interactions. But still, something about her silence pressed faintly at the edges of his thoughts, like a loose thread he had not yet noticed unraveling. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. Contracts were discussed, test drives arranged, numbers negotiated, the rhythm of the showroom steady and efficient. Yet every so often, Blake found himself glancing toward the entrance, just briefly, just enough to notice that she had not returned, and each time, he dismissed the thought almost immediately, replacing it with the certainty that she would not, because people like her never did. As evening approached, the golden light outside softened into a muted glow that reflected off the glass walls. The showroom gradually quieted, footsteps becoming less frequent, voices lower, the energy shifting from performance to closure. Blake reviewed the day's numbers in his office, satisfied with the results. A strong sales day, solid leads, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, as he leaned back in his chair, that same image returned. Emily standing there, calm, unshaken, her eyes steady in a way that did not match the role he had assigned to her. And for a brief moment, doubt flickered, small, almost insignificant, but present. He shook it off, standing up and straightening his jacket. Just another walk-in, he muttered to himself, the words intended to close the matter completely, to seal it off as irrelevant. But the more he repeated it, the less convincing it sounded, as if somewhere deep down, he already knew that the story had not ended when she walked out that door. Outside, the parking lot stretched wide under the dimming sky. Rows of luxury vehicles resting in perfect alignment, untouched, silent, waiting, and far beyond the immediate glow of the showroom lights, something else was moving into place, unseen, unannounced, but inevitable, because moments like this, moments built on quiet dismissal and unchecked arrogance, never truly ended when they appeared to. They simply paused, gathering weight, waiting for the right moment to return, and when they did, they never returned quietly. Morning arrived with a crisp stillness that settled over Harrison Luxury Motors like a polished illusion, the glass walls catching the early sunlight and scattering it across rows of pristine vehicles. Everything in its place, everything controlled, everything exactly as it had been the day before, and yet something beneath that perfection had shifted, though no one could quite name it. Blake Harrison stepped out of his office with the same confident stride, his navy suit immaculate, his expression composed. The kind of presence that filled a room without effort. He checked his watch, adjusted his tie, and surveyed the showroom floor as if confirming that order had been restored overnight, his mind already moving through the day ahead. Appointments, negotiations, numbers, all the things that mattered. Daniel was already there, standing near the entrance with a tablet in hand, but his attention was not on the inventory. His eyes flicked toward the driveway outside, as if expecting something, or perhaps remembering something. The image of Emily Carter leaving the day before still replaying in his thoughts, her silence, her composure, the way she had not reacted the way anyone else would have. It did not fit, and the more he thought about it, the less it made sense. "You are early," Blake remarked as he passed him, his tone casual but observant. Daniel nodded quickly. "Just getting things ready," he replied, though his voice carried a faint distraction. Blake paused for a fraction of a second, studying him, then moved on, dismissing it as nothing, because distractions were for people who did not understand how things worked, and Blake understood exactly how things worked. The first clients of the day began to arrive, well-dressed, confident, fitting perfectly into the environment that had been carefully curated for them. Conversation started, coffee was served, the familiar rhythm returned, smooth and uninterrupted, and for a while, it seemed as though the previous day had been nothing more than a passing moment, already fading into irrelevance. Then, just before 10:00, it happened, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, a shift in the air outside, a shadow crossing the glass facade. Daniel saw it before anyone else, his eyes narrowing slightly as a long, sleek black vehicle turned into the driveway, its movement slow, deliberate, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself because it commanded attention simply by existing. The car rolled forward, its polished surface reflecting the morning light in sharp, controlled lines, and as it came to a stop directly in front of the entrance, something changed inside the showroom. Conversation softened, footsteps slowed, a quiet curiosity spreading from one person to another, like a ripple moving through still water. Blake noticed it next, his gaze following the line of sight toward the entrance, his expression tightening slightly as he recognized the silhouette, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, not just any luxury car, but a statement, a presence, the kind of vehicle that did not arrive without purpose. He straightened instinctively, adjusting his jacket, his mind already shifting, recalibrating, because this was the kind of client that mattered. The engine went silent, and for a moment, everything else did too, the room holding its breath without realizing it, the glass doors reflecting the scene like a frame, and then, slowly, the rear door opened. A single heel touched the pavement first, precise, controlled, followed by the smooth motion of someone stepping out. With quiet confidence, no rush, no hesitation, just presence, undeniable and calm. And as the figure rose fully into view, the sunlight catching her features, Daniel felt his chest tighten, recognition hitting him before anyone else could process it. It was her. Emily Carter stood there, not different, not transformed, but somehow entirely changed, the same simplicity, the same calm expression, and yet now it carried weight, authority, something that had been invisible the day before but now filled the space around her. Inside, the showroom fell into a silence that no one had planned, no one had orchestrated. It simply happened, natural and complete. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, eyes fixed on the entrance, and Blake Harrison, who had built his entire world on reading people instantly, on knowing exactly who belonged and who did not, found himself frozen in a moment he could not immediately understand, because the one person he had already dismissed was now standing at the center of something he could no longer control, and in that stillness, the truth began to surface, slow and undeniable, like a realization that had been waiting patiently for its moment to arrive. The silence did not break when she stepped inside. It deepened, stretching across the marble floor and climbing up the glass walls until it wrapped around every person in the room. Because this was not the same moment as yesterday. This was something heavier, something undeniable. Emily Carter walked forward with measured steps, the soft sound of her heels echoing just enough to be heard, just enough to remind everyone that she was no longer invisible. And as the doors closed behind her, the outside world disappeared, leaving only the weight of what was unfolding inside. Blake Harrison straightened instinctively, his mind racing to reframe the situation, to regain control of the narrative he had lost without realizing it. His smile returned, practiced and precise, but this time it carried a tension that had not been there before. "Welcome back," he said, his voice smooth but slightly tighter than usual, the words hanging in the air as if testing their own credibility, because even he could feel it. Something had changed, something he could not yet define. Emily stopped a few feet away from him, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the room holding its breath again, waiting, watching, because this was no longer a simple interaction. This was a moment, and everyone could feel it. Daniel stood near the side, his grip tightening around his tablet, his eyes moving between them, sensing what was coming before it fully arrived. The recognition already settled in his chest, but the confirmation still just out of reach. Behind Blake, one of the senior associates leaned slightly toward another, whispering under his breath, "Is that the same woman from yesterday?" But the question barely left his lips before it dissolved into silence again, because no one wanted to interrupt what was about to happen. Emily spoke first, her voice calm, clear, and completely unchanged from the day before. "I came back to take another look at the coupe," she said, her tone polite, almost gentle, and yet the words carried a weight that pressed against the room, because now, those same words did not sound the same. Now they echoed differently. Now they meant something more. Blake nodded quickly, stepping into his role. "Of course," he replied, gesturing toward the vehicle with a renewed enthusiasm that bordered on urgency. "I would be happy to personally assist you." And there it was, the shift, subtle but unmistakable. The same man who had dismissed her now offering his full attention. The same voice now wrapped in respect, because perception had changed, and with it, everything else. Emily's eyes moved briefly across the showroom, taking in the same faces that had watched her the day before, the same expressions that had judged her without hesitation, and though no words were spoken, something passed through that moment, a quiet recognition, a reflection of what had been and what was now, and one by one, those faces lowered their gaze, unable to hold it for long. "I believe yesterday you mentioned that this model was reserved for serious clients," she continued, her tone still even, not accusing, not confrontational, just stating what had already happened, and the simplicity of it made it impossible to ignore. Blake's smile faltered for the briefest moment, his mind searching for a response that could undo what had already been said, but there was none, because the truth, once spoken, did not need to be repeated. "There must have been a misunderstanding," he replied quickly, his voice careful now, measured. "We always strive to provide the best experience to all our customers." The words sounded polished, professional, and completely empty, and everyone in the room could hear it, even if no one said a word. Then, from the entrance, another presence entered the scene, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, a man in a dark tailored suit, his posture confident, his expression composed, and as he walked toward Emily, the atmosphere shifted again, deeper this time, more final. Daniel's breath caught slightly as he recognized him, not from personal experience, but from something he had seen before, a name, a face, a reputation that did not belong to this room, at least not until now. The man stopped beside Emily, his presence aligning with hers in a way that made everything suddenly clear, not through words, but through the quiet authority that surrounded them both. And in that moment, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. The silence returned, heavier than before, and Blake Harrison, who had built his confidence on knowing exactly who he was dealing with, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, because the woman he had dismissed was no longer someone he could define, and the man standing beside her was not someone he could afford to misunderstand. And just like that, the balance of the room shifted, completely and irreversibly. The man beside Emily did not rush to speak, and that silence alone carried more authority than any introduction could have, his presence calm, composed, the kind that did not seek attention because it commanded it naturally. And as he stood there, the subtle shift in the room became undeniable. Even the air felt different, heavier, as if every person inside had suddenly realized they were part of something they no longer understood. Blake Harrison felt it first in his posture, a slight stiffness creeping into his shoulders, his confident stance no longer effortless but carefully held together. "Good morning," he said, directing his attention toward the man, his tone respectful now, measured, searching for footing. "How may we assist you today?" The question sounded formal, safe, but underneath it was uncertainty, something Blake rarely allowed himself to feel. The man glanced briefly at him, then back at Emily, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I believe she already made that clear yesterday," he replied, his voice low, steady, and unmistakably controlled. And though he did not raise his volume, every word seemed to reach every corner of the showroom, because silence had already prepared the space for it. A ripple moved through the staff, subtle but visible, heads turning slightly, eyes widening, recognition beginning to take shape in places where certainty had once lived. Daniel's grip tightened again, because now he was sure he had seen that face before, in articles, in business features, in places far removed from this showroom floor. And the realization settled in with quiet clarity. Blake's smile held, but it was no longer natural. "I apologize if there was any confusion," he said quickly, the words coming faster now, as if trying to close a gap that had already widened too far. "We strive to ensure every client receives the highest level of service." The sentence sounded correct, appropriate, and completely disconnected from what had actually happened, and everyone in the room knew it, even if no one spoke. Emily turned her head slightly toward the man beside her, then back to Blake, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, untouched by the shift that had unsettled everyone else. "There was no confusion," she said gently, and the simplicity of those 4 words landed harder than any accusation could have, because they left no room for reinterpretation, no space for excuses, just the quiet truth, presented without force. The man beside her stepped forward then, just one step, but it was enough to shift the entire balance of the space, his presence aligning directly across from Blake now. And for the first time, Blake felt something he could not immediately control, not fear, not yet, but something close, something unfamiliar. "Blake Harrison," the man said, not as a question, but as a statement, precise and certain. Blake nodded automatically. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady but thinner than before. The man gave a small nod, as if confirming something already known. "I am Jonathan Reed," he continued, and the name moved through the room like a quiet shockwave, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because it carried weight, history, influence, the kind that did not need explanation. Daniel exhaled slowly, the last piece falling into place, while the others stood still, their earlier confidence dissolving into something else entirely, something uncertain, something reflective. Blake's mind raced now, connecting details, recalculating everything he thought he understood, and as those connections formed, the reality behind them began to settle in, heavy and inescapable. "Mr. Reed," he said, his tone shifting again, now edged with something closer to urgency. "It is an honor to have you here." The words came quickly, almost too quickly, as if trying to rebuild a foundation that had already cracked. Jonathan Reed's expression did not change, his gaze steady, measured. "This dealership," he said slowly, "became part of our portfolio 3 weeks ago." The sentence landed with quiet precision, each word deliberate, each pause intentional, and as it reached the room, the silence that followed was absolute, complete, because now there was no ambiguity left, no uncertainty to hide behind. Blake felt it fully then, the weight of realization settling over him, not sudden, not explosive, but steady and unavoidable, like a door closing that he had not realized was open. His posture remained upright, but something inside it had shifted, something fundamental, because the structure he relied on, the assumptions he trusted, had just been quietly dismantled in front of everyone. Emily stood exactly where she had been, unchanged, her presence the same as it had always been. Only now it was seen, truly seen, and in that moment, the difference between perception and reality became impossible to ignore, because the person they had dismissed was the one who had never needed their approval, and the room, once filled with judgment, now held only silence. The kind that comes when truth finally replaces assumption, and no one knows what to say next. The silence did not break even after Jonathan Reed's words settled into the room. It deepened, pressing against every surface, every person, until it became impossible to ignore, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about exposure, about a truth that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Blake Harrison felt it in the way his breath slowed, in the way his usual confidence no longer moved as easily through his body, his mind searching for something, anything, that could restore the balance he had lost. But there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to correct, because the moment had already passed, and what remained was consequence. I was not aware, Blake began, his voice careful now, each word chosen with precision, that you were connected to this location. And though the sentence sounded composed, it carried the unmistakable weight of someone trying to regain footing on ground that had already shifted beneath him. Jonathan Reed studied him for a brief moment, not with hostility, not with anger, but with a quiet evaluation that felt far more unsettling. That is the problem, he said simply, his tone even, not raised, not dramatic, and yet it landed with more force than any reprimand could have, because it was not about what Blake did not know. It was about what he assumed he already did. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, her calm now standing in direct contrast to the tension that had filled the room. She had not moved closer, had not stepped back. She simply stood, observing, as if allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, without interference, without urgency. Around them, the staff stood frozen in a quiet awareness, the earlier confidence, the casual laughter, all of it gone, replaced by something far more fragile, reflection, and for some, discomfort, because the lines they had believed were clear had just been erased in front of them. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, replaying the previous day in his mind, every word, every glance, every moment that now carried a different meaning, and the realization settled in with a quiet weight, not just about Emily, but about the environment they had all accepted without question. Blake cleared his throat slightly, straightening his posture as if structure alone could restore control. We value all of our clients, he said. The sentence familiar, practiced, but now it sounded different. Thinner, because it no longer aligned with what everyone had witnessed, and in that disconnect, the truth became even more visible. Jonathan Reed took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the dynamic completely. Value is not something you say, he replied calmly. It is something you demonstrate. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, and impossible to deflect. And as they settled, the room seemed to grow even quieter, if that was possible. Blake nodded slowly, the motion automatic, but behind it, his thoughts moved faster, recalculating, reassessing, searching for a response that could bridge the gap between what had happened and what was now being revealed. But every option felt insufficient, every explanation too late. Emily finally moved then, not forward, not away, but just enough to shift her weight, her eyes meeting Blake's for a brief moment, steady, calm, and in that single glance, there was no anger, no accusation, just clarity, the kind that does not need to be spoken because it is already understood. Yesterday, she said softly, her voice carrying through the silence without effort. You made a decision about who I was. She paused, not for effect, but because the truth did not need to be rushed. Today, nothing about me has changed, and that was it. No raised voice, no extended explanation, just a statement, simple and complete, and in its simplicity, it revealed everything. Blake felt it fully then, not just the situation, but the weight behind it. The realization that the difference between yesterday and today was never about Emily. It was about perception, about assumption, about the quiet choices that define how someone sees the world, and in that understanding, something shifted inside him, subtle but undeniable. No one spoke, no one moved. The showroom remained still, as if the entire space was holding onto the moment, allowing it to settle, to be felt completely, because this was no longer just an interaction. It was a reflection, one that could not be undone, only understood, and as the silence stretched on, it became clear that what had changed was not the person standing in front of them, but the way they had chosen to see her, and that realization, quiet and undeniable, was far more powerful than anything that could have been said. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected, not empty but heavy, filled with the quiet weight of realization settling into every corner of the showroom. And for the first time, no one rushed to break it, because everyone understood that whatever came next would define more than just a transaction. It would define them. Blake Harrison inhaled slowly, the controlled rhythm of his breath returning as he forced himself back into composure. But this time it was different, no longer built on certainty, but on awareness, a fragile structure that required careful balance. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone shifting once again, softer now, more deliberate. "I would like to personally apologize for yesterday." The words came out measured, practiced, but beneath them there was something new, something less rehearsed, something closer to acknowledgement than performance. Emily looked at him, not immediately responding, her gaze steady, almost reflective, as if weighing not the words themselves, but the space they came from. And in that pause, the room leaned into the silence again, waiting. Jonathan Reed remained beside her, his posture unchanged, his presence still and composed, but his attention sharp, observing, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was not his correction to make, it was Blake's to face. "It was never about the car," Emily said finally, her voice calm, even, but carrying clearly through the quiet, and the simplicity of her statement shifted the focus instantly, away from the surface, towards something deeper, something harder to avoid. Blake nodded slowly, the meaning settling in before he could fully process it. "I understand," he replied, though his voice carried the faint hesitation of someone still catching up to the truth in real time. "No," Emily said gently, not interrupting, but clarifying. "You did not." And again, there was no accusation in her tone, no sharp edge, just clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial. And that was what made it impossible to deflect. Around them, the staff stood motionless, the earlier hierarchy completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet awareness that extended beyond this single moment. Daniel lifted his gaze again, watching closely, because now he understood that what he was witnessing was not just a correction, but a shift in perspective, one that could not be undone once seen. Blake exhaled, a subtle release of tension that he could no longer hold back, and for the first time, since the moment began, he did not try to immediately respond, because he knew that anything he said too quickly would only reveal how much he had misunderstood. Instead, he stood there, allowing the silence to exist, allowing it to expose the gap between who he believed himself to be and what he had shown. Jonathan Reed glanced briefly at Emily, then back at Blake, his expression unchanged. But there was a quiet expectation in it now, not demanding, not forceful, but present, as if the outcome of this moment would speak for itself without needing to be directed. "Yesterday," Blake began again, his voice slower now, less polished, more careful. "I made a judgment based on appearance." He paused, the admission settling into the room, heavier than anything he had said before, because it was no longer hidden behind professional language. It was direct, undeniable, and that was wrong. And there it was, not a performance, not a strategy, but a statement that carried weight because it had not come easily. Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her eyes held a quiet recognition, not of the apology itself, but of the shift behind it, the difference between words spoken to resolve a situation and words spoken because something had been understood. The room remained still, no one moving, no one speaking, because now the moment had reached something deeper than discomfort. It had reached accountability, and that was not something that could be rushed or softened. "Respect," Emily said softly after a moment, "is not something you offer when it is convenient." She continued, her voice steady, her words simple. "It is something you choose before you know who someone is." And as she spoke, the meaning settled into the space around her, not as a lesson being taught, but as a truth being revealed, one that did not need to be emphasized because it was already clear. Blake lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of her words landing fully now, because they did not just describe what had happened, they described how it should have been different, and in that realization, there was no defense left, only understanding. No one spoke, no one moved. The silence returned once more, but this time it was not uncomfortable. It was reflective, the kind that follows when something important has been seen clearly for the first time. And in that stillness, the showroom, once defined by status and assumption, felt different, not because anything physical had changed, but because something unseen had shifted, something that could not be reversed, only carried forward. No one moved even after her words settled, because they did not end the moment. They deepened it, stretching it into something that demanded to be felt, not just heard. And in that stillness, the true shift began to take form, not in what was said, but in what was understood. Blake Harrison stood where he was, no longer trying to control the room, no longer shaping the interaction, but absorbing it, allowing the weight of everything that had unfolded to settle without resistance. And for the first time, the confidence he carried was no longer built on status, but on something far less certain, awareness. "What would you like to do now?" he asked finally, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier authority, no longer leading, but offering. And the difference was clear to everyone present. Emily glanced toward the coupe again, the same vehicle that had been the center of yesterday's dismissal, its polished surface reflecting the overhead lights in perfect symmetry, untouched, unchanged, just like her, and yet everything about the moment around it had transformed. She took a few steps forward, slow, deliberate, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the car, her reflection appearing faintly in its surface, not as someone out of place, but as someone fully present, fully seen. And as she stood there, the room seemed to recalibrate around her, no longer defining her, but responding to her. Daniel stepped slightly closer, instinctively, not to intervene, but to witness, his earlier uncertainty replaced by clarity, because now he understood that what he had seen the day before was not weakness, it was restraint, and that difference changed everything. "It is a beautiful car," Emily said softly, her tone thoughtful, almost reflective, as if she was speaking to the moment itself rather than the people around her. And for a second, it felt as though the tension might dissolve into something ordinary, something transactional, but it did not, because this was never about the car. Jonathan Reed remained where he was, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, allowing Emily to lead, because this was her moment, not his, and the distinction mattered. Blake took a step forward, careful, measured. "It would be my honor to arrange everything for you," he said. And this time, the words carried sincerity, not performance, because they were no longer about securing a sale. They were about correcting something that could not truly be undone, only acknowledged. Emily turned slightly, her eyes meeting his again, and for a brief moment, there was silence, not heavy, not tense, but clear, as if the space between them had finally aligned with reality. "You already showed me everything I needed to see yesterday," she replied gently, and the words landed with quiet finality, not harsh, not dismissive, but complete, because they closed a door that had been opened by assumption. Blake felt it, not as rejection, but as consequence, the understanding settling in fully now, because some moments did not offer a second chance in the way he was used to. Some moments simply revealed what could not be changed. No one spoke, no one interrupted, the room holding on to the clarity of what had just been said, because it was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it was absolute. Emily stepped back from the car, her hand leaving its surface, the reflection fading as she moved, and with that single motion, the possibility of returning to what could have been disappeared completely. Jonathan took a step toward her, not to lead, but to accompany, his presence steady beside hers, and together, they turned toward the exit, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. As they walked, the showroom remained silent, every eye following, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, because what had just happened was no longer about status or wealth. It was about something far more fundamental, something that could not be bought or displayed, only practiced. Daniel watched them go, his thoughts quiet but clear, understanding settling in with a weight that would stay long after the moment passed, because now he knew that the smallest interactions often revealed the largest truths. Blake remained where he stood, his posture still composed, but his perspective altered in a way that could not be reversed. The image of Emily standing in front of him, unchanged from the day before, now carried a meaning he could not ignore, and as the glass doors opened and closed once more, the sound echoed softly through the showroom, marking the end of something that had never really been about a car, and the beginning of something that could not be undone, only remembered. The doors closed softly behind them, and for a long moment, no one inside the showroom moved, as if the sound itself had sealed something permanent into place, not loud, not dramatic, but final. And in that stillness, the space that once felt controlled and predictable now felt unfamiliar, as if something essential had been quietly removed and replaced with something far more honest. Blake Harrison remained standing near the center of the room, his posture still upright, his expression composed, but there was no longer any illusion behind it. No performance left to sustain, only the quiet presence of someone who had just seen himself clearly for the first time, and that clarity did not fade quickly. Around him, the staff slowly returned to motion, but it was different now, quieter, more deliberate. Conversations resumed in softer tones, footsteps more measured, as if everyone was aware that something had shifted, not just in what had happened, but in what it meant. Daniel stood near the entrance, his eyes lingering on the glass doors long after Emily and Jonathan had disappeared from view, replaying the moment in his mind, not as something extraordinary, but as something revealing, because it had not required power to expose the truth, only presence. And that realization stayed with him, steady and undeniable. Blake exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and turned his gaze toward the same coupe that had been the center of everything, its polished surface reflecting the showroom lights exactly as it had before, unchanged, untouched, and yet it no longer represented what it once did, because now it was tied to something else, something that could not be polished or displayed, only remembered. He walked toward it, his steps measured, not to inspect it, not to sell it, but to stand beside it, to see it as it was, without the assumptions that had once guided him so easily. And in that moment, the simplicity of it became clear. The car had never been the point, it had only been the stage. Back to work, one of the associates said quietly, attempting to restore normalcy. But even that sounded different now, less certain, less automatic, because normal had just been redefined in a way that could not be ignored. Blake nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because he understood that work would continue, the showroom would function, sales would be made. But something beneath it had changed, something that would follow every interaction from that moment forward. He turned to Daniel, who was still near the entrance. "Make sure every client is greeted the same way," he said, his voice calm, steady, but different now, stripped of the edge it once carried. And though the instruction was simple, its meaning extended far beyond procedure, because this time, it was not about maintaining an image, it was about correcting a perspective. Daniel nodded, meeting his gaze with a quiet understanding, because he had already seen it, already felt it, and now he knew what it meant. The rest of the day unfolded without incident. Clients came and went, conversations resumed, transactions continued. But beneath every exchange, there was a subtle awareness, a pause, a moment where assumptions were checked before they could take hold. And though it was not spoken, it was present, carried in the tone of voices, in the way eyes met without judgment, in the small decisions that defined how people were seen. Outside, the sunlight shifted slowly across the lot, casting longer shadows as the day moved forward, and somewhere beyond the immediate reach of the showroom, Emily Carter continued on with her day, unchanged, unaffected by what had been revealed, because she had never needed the room to see her in order to be who she was. And inside, as the final light of the afternoon reflected against the glass, Blake stood once more in the space he had always believed he understood, now aware that it had never truly been about the cars, or the clients, or the numbers, but about something far simpler, far more difficult to maintain, the choice to see people clearly before deciding who they are. And that day, without noise, without spectacle, the showroom had learned what dignity looks like.